Welcome to another episode of the Michael Yardney podcast. Today I've got a special guest, Ross Elliot, a prominent voice in the property market and urban development industry. Now, Ross recently penned a thought-provoking article that he called The Housing Fix We Actually Can Do. In that, he delved into the impact of taxes on property affordability, but he also offered some practical solutions to this issue. So today I want to discuss with Ross the current tax policies and how they affect housing affordability, and I think you're going to be surprised when you hear how differently new houses compared to established properties are taxed and what it does to affordability. We're also going to look at some solutions, but despite an election year and lots of people going to talk about property and affordability, I don't think much is going to change. So let's unpack what's really making housing less affordable for many Australians.
Welcome to the Michael Yardney podcast, where twice each week you will learn a number of new ideas regarding success, property investment and money in around 30 minutes. Our show is brought to you by Metropole, who specialise in helping you grow, protect and pass on your wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. Now here's your host, Michael Yardney, Australia's authority in wealth creation through property, who has been voted one of Australia's top 50 most influential thought leaders.
The current state of Australia's housing market's being marked by skyrocketing prices and dwindling affordability, making it extremely difficult for many to achieve the desired Australian dream of home ownership. Rising property taxes, regulatory burdens and a shortage of new housing stock only seem to be making the problem worse, driving prices even higher. Currently, first-home buyers, low-income families, they're the hardest hit, often finding themselves priced out of the market. Of course, being an election year, there's a lot of talk about housing affordability, but little is happening. So I'm keen to discuss these issues with my guest, Ross Elliot, a prominent figure in the property industry, with too many credits to his name to mention them all. But let me mention a few. I'll give you an example of a few in the hope of helping you understand why, when Ross speaks, I listen. He's chair of the Lord Mayor's Better Suburbs Initiative, Director of Suburban Futures, immediate past President of the Urban Land Institute of Brisbane, plus a string of other important roles in the property industry. So, with that introduction, welcome back, Ross.
Thanks very much, Michael. It's good to be back.
Now, Ross, housing affordability, or I guess the lack of it's in the news a lot lately. Yet despite many inquiries, task forces, talk fests proposing solutions, nothing seems to be working to make housing more affordable. Why is that, Ross?
We don't seem to have the willingness to recognise that this is a policy-induced problem, that we've actively contributed to this at the three levels of government and have not recognised that failing and therefore changed the policies. In fact, this is not the first time we've had this issue. As you would know, Michael, back in 2007, interest rates were on the rise and we had newspapers, talkback radio, TV news bulletins, parliamentary debates. It was a red-hot issue back then. Well, all that happened was the GFC came along, money became cheaper and the interest rates declined and fell and fell and fell until they were almost zero. And all that that did was alleviate the problem, a bit like taking a painkiller to deal with the pain. We hadn't dealt with the problem. It was still there. It was always still there. And now that the interest rates have risen again in the last couple of years, we've applied the pain back to the problem. So the underlying problem has never changed, and we haven't changed the policies that have created it.
So therefore, it actually dates back a long, long time. I first remember hearing about this in the late 1980s when people said that our kids will never be able to afford housing again. Property prices can't keep going up. And that's when interest rates started to rise then as well. So it seems like you've outlined some bad news for people who think they've got a fix, Ross.
I don't think, I'm fairly certain that any number of new housing ministers, we've got a new federal housing minister, state government inquiries or even local government investigations, task forces and the whole sort of conga line of interests who are parading before us, professing to have the fix, the solution. I don't think that anything is going to change because they're the same people in my view, who've been contributing to the problem over many years. Look, put it this way. One of the things we have to recognise is that there's almost nothing we can do about the median house price in the market. We can dampen demand, we can improve supply, that will tinker at the margins at best. The only way really to fix affordability when it comes to the median house price in the major cities would be for prices to fall by about 30%.
Wow.
And we imagine what that would do to our banking and financial
Yes.
system. It's so heavily leveraged into real estate that it would be on the brink of collapse. Well, the other way you'd solve it is by raising incomes by about 30%, and that would collapse the economy. So, we've made this mess. We're stuck with it to a large degree. It will take a very long time to return that to some sort of balance with wages. What we can do is talk about the cost of new supply and the difficulty of bringing new stock to the market. And this is something we've made incredibly difficult in terms of regulation and incredibly expensive in terms of the way we tax it.
Ross, 70% of Australians own their home. Half of them don't even have a mortgage. So for those millions and millions of Australians, they're not wanting houses to become more affordable. Now, I have kids and grandkids, and a lot of people understand that the next generation has to get into the housing market. You said the banking system. The government similarly doesn't want to be overseeing a housing collapse either. So there's, I guess, too many vested interests. The Australian housing market is too big to collapse, isn't it?
Yes. Well, I think so, yes. And it's almost impossible to move in terms of price relative to wages. Those two things have moved out of kilter, and I think they're going to stay out of kilter for a long time, Michael. But as I said, it's the cost of a new house or a new apartment. This is the thing where we can actually have some influence, where we can make some policy decisions that will have immediate effect, and yet we still seem reluctant to do that.
Well, I'd like to have a talk about that. Now, we know that the federal government has got an initiative to build 1.2 million new dwellings over the next 5 years. They brought this out last year, and the clock started ticking in July this year. But already we're behind. There's not enough building approvals or properties being completed.
It's not a clock that's ticking, Michael. I think it's a bomb.
Interesting that you say that. I can understand why you say that. So on that basis, we're not building enough, and the ones we're building are too expensive. So can you explain a bit about those tax policies you talk about, how they affect housing affordability and market dynamics?
Okay, so let's take first of all, we'll start with an established house. So let's pick something that's in a well-to-do neighbourhood, a good quality suburb, nice tree-lined streets, local libraries, pools, good shops, a lot of amenity, very expensive, okay? The main tax you're going to be up for in buying a property like that, which might be $2 or $3 or $4 million, will be the stamp duty. And you will complain about it because it's a separate cost in the settlement transaction, so everyone is aware of it. Now, 4 or 5% stamp duty is a lot, or sometimes a little less if you're a first-home buyer, but that is pales into insignificance compared with the 30% or more that we tax new supply. And the federal government, one of the biggest culprits, have their hand in the till because of the GST. So the GST, of course, only applies to a new house or a new apartment. It applies to the whole chain of supply and labour that goes into creating that product. So whatever the cost of your new apartment is, 10%, or cost of your new house and land, 10% of that goes to the federal government. Then on top of that, you've got state-imposed or sometimes council-imposed infrastructure levies, as they're called, the intent is that they're there to provide for the infrastructure that isn't available in new areas or in densifying areas. But that can be another $30,000 or $40,000. And look, the list goes on. You've got the holding costs, you've got the DA fees with council, you've got any number of other compliance costs, you've got the connections to utilities and the demands that they will make on what has to be provided to the new house or the new unit. And before you know it, on a $700,000 new house and land, for example, you could be looking at $150,000, $200,000 in taxes, fees, charges, and all the rest of it, let alone, that's not even including the regulatory complexity of getting an approval.
And then you pay stamp duty on it when you buy it too, Ross.
Well, that's true, yes. But the stamp duty is the smaller part
Yes.
of the equation for the new housing product. So the new stuff, the stuff that we need desperately to add to the market, comes with a regulatory mess in terms of the approvals processes. NIMBYs, all sorts of factors make it very difficult to bring new supply to the market, and then we tax it. And we tax it up front. So when you bought the established house that's been around for perhaps 100 years in the established well-to-do neighbourhood, they never paid any upfront contribution to the amenity and the infrastructure that's in their area in that neighbourhood. They contributed to it over time through their rates bill, and every time the property was transacted, again through stamp duty. But there's no upfront fee on those established houses in those established markets, but there is on the new stuff. And it's very important, I think, that people understand exactly how we are taxing new supply at a rate much higher than we tax homes in well-to-do areas owned by people with millions of dollars.
Well, clearly this has a huge impact on those first home buyers who are trying to get into the market because, in general, they're the sort of properties that they're buying.
Yeah, correct. That's exactly correct.
So that makes it hard. So why don't policymakers address this disparity between the taxes they put on new houses and established properties?
Well, it wouldn't be very popular, for one. So if you had to say, right, we're going to alleviate the tax on new housing supply, but we want to still capture the same total tax take out of housing, you'd obviously have to apply more taxes to the established house market, either via a land tax or some other mechanism, which would make you incredibly unpopular and probably kicked out of office. So that's the simple political answer as to why that doesn't happen.
You argue that we've got to reduce the cost associated with new housing stock to the market. Are there any policies that could be changed, that could be introduced, that could achieve this?
Well, I think one of the things that we have talked about in this country a lot but have never done is confront the issue around the expectation of what infrastructure is going to be provided in a new housing estate, for example. Now, we don't need to start with the gold-plated infrastructure. We can start with less than that. Even if you look at the development of greenfield housing estates, for example, there's an argument about sequential development, which means rolling out the big sewer line and the big water supply lines in a sequential manner so that estates are developed in line. We now have the technology to do large-scale off-grid wastewater, for example, which doesn't need to be connected to the main wastewater line. So that's a far more costly way to get a new estate off the ground. That's one example. Then there are other mandates around the compliance codes of the cost of building roads with curbing, channel, and all the rest of it. Now, they can be modified, and we could actually learn to live with a little less if affordability was genuinely what we were concerned about. So there's a few compromises along the way, and I think the other thing too is to learn a different way of funding that infrastructure is through infrastructure bonds, which are paid back through the people who've moved into an area, but they're paid back either through their rates or through some other mechanism, which is simply that the local authority or the developer borrows a large amount of money to fund the infrastructure. But rather than that being levied up front in a single big hit amount, it is paid off over time. And this is how they do it in Texas and a number of states in the United States. And it seems to be very effective.
I can see how that could work. And sure, you've got to factor it into the cost of buying a property. But if that happens for all new properties, it's going to even out. And it actually, I guess, means you pay down the track rather than straight away. Now, property investors are often blamed for our housing affordability problems as well. People are citing negative gearing or capital gains tax benefits being unfair. What are your thoughts about that?
It's a difficult one. Clearly, they are in the market competing with first home buyers on established product. They are also sometimes the essential buyers for new product to get it off the ground, to make it viable. So if you take an apartment building, for example, without the investor market, the developer may not be able to sell enough of that product off the plan, so to speak, to make the feasibility work. And if the feasibility doesn't work, the entire thing doesn't get built. So the investors might take 25% of the stock, which means the other 75% actually comes to the market. But without that 25%, none of it may happen.
Sure, because in general, lenders want to see a significant level of pre-commitment to make sure that the project is viable. Now, property investors in Australia, and it's different to overseas, are filling a service need, a requirement where in other countries the government often provides housing for rental accommodation, but a third of Australians renting, and not necessarily because they're poor, it's partly because of where they are in their stage of their life for many people as well. And yes, property investors do get benefits. Interestingly, one thing that's often forgotten is the big benefit, tax benefit homeowners get, Ross. In other words, if you bought that $2.5 million home you mentioned a while ago, and then your kids have left home and you want to right size and you sell it, there's no capital gains tax. So while people are complaining that property investors are getting a capital gains tax exemption to 50% off, homeowners don't pay any capital gains tax at all.
No, well, once again, that would be a massively unpopular move for any government to consider. And any time in Australia, if it has raised its head during an election, parties run a mile from it. I'm not advocating it either, by the way. What I think, though, we've got to recognise is that there are three layers of government, all with their fingers in the till when it comes to housing, and none of them accepting responsibility. And in fairness, not one level of government is to blame. But I think it's time we looked at how they are collectively contributing to the problem and therefore how we collectively get them to address it.
Okay, what about foreign investors? They're currently being blamed as well. Actually, not as much now as in a couple of years ago, but they're coming back into the market. What do you think foreign investment has impact it's got on housing prices, and how should that be managed?
Well, I think the answer there is it's very similar to the domestic investor story, that a lot of foreign investors are restricted to buying, if it's for investment purpose rather than a place to live, restricted to buying new stock. And quite often, they are the market that will actually enable the development to proceed. Without them, you may not be able to sell enough product off the plan in advance. Therefore, we don't see those things proceeding. We've never really had a massive problem, in my view at least, with international investment. It's raised its head in the past. You and I would remember the days of the Japanese investment wave, and that was apparently going to cart the thing off across the Pacific. The property is immobile. Whoever owns it, it's here. It does create some local challenges, I guess, so if you're competing for the same product with international buyers who might be much better off. But I don't know that can be singled out as the cause of our current problems.
Well, the last residential property construction boom, when all those high-rise apartments were built, was underpinned by foreign investors, again, buying off the plan, getting finance for developers to continue the development. Unfortunately, a lot of the stock that they bought was poor quality, built out of paper mache, not the right footprints. That wasn't the investors' fault, other than they didn't know what's going on. I think some developers took advantage of them. But I agree with you that in general, foreign investors can't buy established residential property, even though they can buy commercial properties, or with special visas, they can buy established homes. But I think people are complaining, I'm going to auction and then a foreign investor's outbidding me. They're probably an Australian who may have foreign parents or were born overseas. That's a very different thing, isn't it?
Yeah, it is a different thing. And I go back to saying that that's the established market that people are complaining about, when it comes to auctions and so on. When we look at the new housing market and we look at new greenfield estates or, subdivisions, we look at new apartment buildings, I think it's a very different profile of buyer. And as you said, the house and land market, the new house and land market has typically been one favoured by young families who are looking to start out their lives, raise kids and so on. That's the product that we are taxing in a very unfair way, and that we are regulating the life out of it, basically. No wonder it is in short supply and so expensive.
Well, I guess there's no simple answer to the housing affordability and actually lack of stock situation either. That's not going to turn around quickly either. So, what do you see the long-term implications of this? What's going to happen?
Some of it, I think we're already starting to see. There was a report in recent weeks that our birth rates are declining very significantly. And the greatest of those declines is in inner city areas where the higher density housing is, which runs contrary to the argument that families are happy to live in apartments. Some are, it's great, but obviously it's not the preferred mode. So people are either deferring having children or having fewer children when they do. That's an obvious sign. I think there's also going to be, if this doesn't get corrected at some stage, there's going to be a massive issue of intergenerational equity. There will be more real estate wealth concentrated in fewer hands, and those who get into the market will do so via inheritance, not via equality of opportunity based on their job or their savings habits. And so on. So that's going to be, I think, a real problem going further forward into history. I don't know where that will end. I mean, I could see the day where governments will then intervene and say, we'll fix this by imposing death duties.
Oh, there's going to be the very significant wealth transfer as the baby boomers die off, and various people are suggesting anywhere between $4.5 and $6 trillion going to be passed on. But that's going to, in general, go to the kids of the baby boomers who are already Gen Xers and probably in their homes, and their kids have left home as well. So maybe baby boomers should be passing it on with a warm hand now to their children and grandchildren rather than with a cold hand later. But there's also currently the Bank of Mum and Dad helping people, and it's creating the haves and have-nots. And I don't like seeing that in society in Australia. We're losing the middle ground, aren't we?
We are. That is exactly the problem. That is exactly the problem. That intergenerational wealth transfer is going to be, as I said, it'll be concentrated in fewer hands. The amount of wealth transferred from boomers to millennials or Gen Z will increase individually, but there will be a large cohort of people out there whose parents won't have the wealth to transfer. And this move to build to rent and permanent renting and so on, that will mean that as those people age, they won't have that wealth, logically, unless they've been very, very successful with their superannuation. They're not going to have that wealth to be able to transfer. So a bigger proportion of the population are going to be closed out of the housing market. And I believe, I think you do as well, that there is nothing better than investing in your own home and making the improvements to it and looking at it both as an investment and as a home. This is kind of the foundation of Australian society we're talking about.
I fully agree with you. That, again, I'm interested in property investment, but I believe the first investment should be your home. And I think those who are getting to retirement age without having their home paid off are going to have real financial problems when you see what little is left over when you get the pension nowadays, because there's not enough social housing either, is there?
No, there's not. And that's almost impossible to deliver as well, if you think about it. In the big cities, Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane, to find the sites to build and develop social housing is now extremely difficult. Most land is spoken for. But really the only place you can put social housing that's genuinely affordable rather than heavily subsidised, there's a big difference, would be on the outskirts of our larger urban areas. And to do that, we'd have to expand the urban footprint, and that would be criticised as contributing to sprawl. But, what do we want? Do we want people to have a roof over their head? Let's provide them with free public transport if that's it's very cost effective if that was what was needed to service some new outer urban communities. But, what do you want? Do you anti-sprawl, or do you want people to be living in tents? I mean, that's kind of where we're at now.
It is. That's scary to see those 10 cities. Just on the other side of things, with new construction, there are interestingly more stringent requirements for sustainable housing, climate change, that's actually making it much more expensive to build. And in general, we're building much bigger accommodation than other parts of the world, but often at the moment on smaller blocks of land, Ross.
Yeah. Well, I think in New South Wales it's called Basics, I think. There were just some building code changes that came into effect in Queensland, and according to the Housing Industry Association, they've added probably $30,000 to the cost of a new dwelling. And it's not like the person who's buying that new house and land will see that separate invoice, if you like, and they're paying for it. It's all buried in the cost. The only separate invoice they'll see is the stamp duty. They won't see the $60,000 or $70,000 GST bill or the infrastructure levy or the compliance with disability and sustainability codes. And the irony is that when those codes are introduced, every new innovation is only applied to new stock. It's not applied to the 99.9% of pre-existing stock. And if you're talking about wanting to make housing more energy efficient, well, you're not achieving anything by just applying those rules only to new builds. You would have to say, logically, if we want houses to consume less energy in heating, cooling, lighting, and so on, we're going to introduce mandatory upgrades to sustainability measures, which will apply to all houses. And once again, that would have a serious adverse political effect on anyone proposing it. But if you're genuinely committed to seeing that sort of sustainability change, that's what you would do, because otherwise all you've done is penalise a small group of people who are buying the new stock.
Now, I know some people are going to listen to this and say, well, there are two smart people who've been around property a long time. Why haven't they got a solution? I think we're trying to actually bring up what's going on. And I don't think most people realise how much the government is adding to the cost of new dwellings and just accelerating the unaffordability. But considering all your experience in the property markets and you've been very much involved in public policy, is there anywhere we can start? Any suggestions you can make?
We've opened the gates on immigration and population growth in a major way in recent years. And most of our population growth is due to immigration policy. So this was a deliberate policy move by the federal government under Prime Minister Albanese. He's opened that immigration, the growth rate, to a speed and a volume of growth that we're not very good at coping with. So that's creating a huge problem. But the problem is also largely confined to 3, maybe 4 cities, major cities. And that's creating huge problems. I can tell you that in some of the regional Queensland cities, the affordability formula, housing costs relative to incomes, has slightly improved since 2007 because demand has not been anywhere near as strong, and they have more than adequate supplies of land to develop into the future. And what we haven't done, however, is to invest in many of these regional cities so that they are seen as attractive places to live and to work. They need to have the same standard of hospitals and healthcare as we offer people in a city like Sydney, for example. They need to have the same opportunities for education, and that includes the choice of education establishments, private and public and tertiary and so on. They should have the same quality of access to urban amenity, whether that's parks, gardens, cycleways, all the rest of it. So we haven't done a very good job of sharing that investment around or of capitalising our regional cities and towns so that they are seen as competitive in a lifestyle and employment and livability sense to what the big cities allegedly offer.
Well, Ross, I enjoy reading your blogs, and I'm going to leave a link in the show notes so people can get the Finger on the Pulse blog that comes out. And I want to read the last paragraph of your blog that I asked these questions about. And you said, reform is possible, but as long as we entertain the voodoo economics paraded as credible solutions to our current housing challenges, be prepared to watch this strategy get more reruns than a B-grade soap opera. A good turn of phrase, but I think it's very true. Nothing is going to change, but there's going to be a lot of rhetoric this year with an election year coming up, Ross.
Yeah, there's an election in Queensland, and then there's a federal election, which will be within the next 12 months, I imagine. And yes, you're right. There'll be a lot of rhetoric. There'll be calls for more inquiries. There'll be calls for more task forces. That the same suspects and the same policy settings will be untouched. And that's where I think we've just got to learn to identify that we've been doing this for these similar policy settings for the best part of nearly 30 years, and to recognise that many of these settings are actually creating the problem. Right? They haven't improved things. In the post-war era, growth was not constrained anywhere near to the extent it is now. We had record levels. We had the best housing affordability measures of almost any developed country in the Western world. And now, in the space of 30 years thereabouts, we have some of the worst. So what a marvellous turnaround. What an incredible turnaround in such a relatively short space of time. And for a country with so much land, it just seems crazy to think that we're running out of land in our big cities.
Well, I always enjoy our chats. You bring a great perspective to things, Ross. Thank you once again for your time. And as I said, I'll leave a link to your blog in the show notes so people can also get your insights. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Michael.
I hope you got some benefit from my chat with Ross, which showed that there's nothing that's going to happen in the short term that's going to help the housing affordability issue. Now, I want to explain a bit more about that in a second. But before I do, if you enjoyed my chat and you don't currently subscribe to the Michael Yardney podcast, wherever you're listening to this or watching this on YouTube, please stop for a sec and subscribe so twice a week you get the information from my guests and me. Also, by now you probably know I run another podcast once a week every Wednesday with demographer Simon Kirstenmacher, where we unpack the demographic trends that are going to shape our future, and they're very important for property as well. Different discussion, Simon and me, but while you're subscribing to things, just stop for a second and subscribe to the Demographics Decoded podcast on whichever podcast app you're listening to. Just look for Demographics Decoded. And I hope you've done that before I actually explain to you that, yes, housing affordability is going to remain an issue. And having children and grandchildren, I understand how it's getting harder and harder. So some people are envying those who already own property. But can I say, property was expensive when I started. Property has always seemed expensive for those who got into the market. So some are looking and saying, oh, they were lucky. No, those who currently own properties are actually doing well because they've taken action. And if you haven't taken action, let me ask you a question. What's the price of procrastination cost you? I mean, over the last year, property values in many parts of Australia have increased by double-digit capital growth, and rents have gone up by double digits as well. And those who procrastinated, waiting for everything to be perfect, missed out on some tremendous opportunities. But in my mind, it's not too late. So if you're wondering what's ahead and how to take advantage of our housing markets, if you're uncertain about whether you should buy, sell, hold, or just wait, or if you're searching for a great opportunity to come knocking or waiting patiently for everything to be right, my suggestion is have a chat with my team at Metropole, and we help you plan to become the property investor you plan to become, and we help home buyers as well. We're much more than just buyer's agents. We actually strategically help our clients through planning to help them plan to become the people they plan to become, and then help them implement the plan. So locating investment-grade properties is currently more elusive than ever, but we have our own teams on the ground in the big capital cities, so we don't fly in and fly out. So why not have a chat with the team at Metropole to help build your property portfolio or help you buy your next home? We're big enough to tip the scales in your favour, but still small enough to care. Metropole.com.au. I've left a link in the show notes.
Now here's Michael's mindset message. Remember, a change in your thinking will lead to a change in your life.
In my mindset message today, I'd like to ask you a question. How many good summers do you have left? Now, this change in season that we're experiencing is a welcome reminder that we're not living in a never-ending now. Time marches on and waits for no one. So whether you find yourself on your way into or out of another summer, it's a good time to reflect on the shortness of time. At this time of the year, we tend to ponder about the year that's been and start thinking about our aspirations for what lies ahead. We're roaring into the next year. And while the days may feel long, the years, boy, are they short. So maybe let me ask you another question. What is wealth? A simplistic definition of wealth is the amount of money that you've got access to. But this unfortunately traps many people into spending their finite time to accumulate as much money as they can. Now, I know I talk a lot about money and properties and wealth in this podcast. And that's why I have these mindset messages with you every session as well, to balance things out. Because, as I said, chasing money, unfortunately traps many people into spending their finite time to accumulate as much money as they can. And we know that money has value, and wasting it seems silly, but we all throw away something far more valuable every day: time. One of the few truly finite resources, the amount of time we get. It's uncertain, but we do know it's limited. So those who attain monetary wealth realise, sometimes too late, that real wealth is the ability to spend the money to buy time. We find meaning in being able to spend time on our terms, doing things we love and doing things that bring us joy. One of the few benefits of the pandemic that we've gone through is it's forced us to spend time differently, very differently how we used to. It's given us a valuable opportunity to recalibrate how we view the trade-off between time and money. Okay, time's an abstract concept, difficult to get our heads around at times. One exercise that'll bring it to life is to consider how many specific events or seasons you may have left. How many books will you realistically still be able to read? How many holidays do you have left to enjoy with your parents or your children? How many good summers do you have to look forward to? Ones where you're healthy enough to enjoy it. You see, we rarely reflect on how much quality time we have left. We're mostly caught in the hustle and bustle of life. Whilst the time we've got left is limited, there is enough of it to give us a meaningful life if we use it wisely and we're conscious of how much of it we've got left. I read recently that the Roman philosopher Seneca wisely said, "It's not that we have a short space of time, but that we waste much of it. Life is long enough, and it has been given in sufficiently generous measure to allow the accomplishment of the very greatest things if the whole of it is well invested." Now, isn't that interesting? Because if you get emails from me, you'd know that at the end of my emails, I usually write something like, "Spend your time wisely." So, how many good summers do you have left? Spend this summer wisely. Thank you for spending the last little while with me. I hope you got some benefit from this show. Hey, but before you move on to the next podcast you're hoping to listen to, please let me remind you that I have another show that I produce once a week with leading demographer Simon Kirstenmacher that we call Demographics Decoded, where we unveil the trends that are going to shape your future. This is a must-listen-to podcast for anyone interested in property investment, business or entrepreneurship. So if you don't currently subscribe to Demographics Decoded, please stop for a second and subscribe on your favourite podcast app or on YouTube. Now, if you did enjoy today's show and you know somebody else who'd benefit, please tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast and Demographics Decoded. There's a share button on every podcast app. On Apple Podcast, there are 3 little buttons at the top of the player. Or just talk to them, tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. I hope you're going to be doing them a favour. You're definitely going to be doing me a favour in helping in my quest to make as many people as possible financially literate. Now, you can catch up with me in between these shows on social media, or you can join my private Facebook group. Just go to Facebook and look for the Property Update Facebook group. And I've got a special bonus for you to say thank you for subscribing. Just go to podcastbonus.com.au. There's a link in the show notes, podcastbonus.com.au, where I've got a bunch of ebooks and reports. That's my way of saying thank you to you for taking the time to listen. Oh, by the way, if you haven't listened to the many podcast episodes we've already got, we're well into our 600s of episodes now. You can always listen to the old episodes, which each have lessons about property investment, success and money. Once again, thanks for listening to today's show.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, which was brought to you by Metropole, who help their clients grow, protect and pass on their wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you like what you heard and don't already subscribe, you'll find us on iTunes or on your favourite Android app as the Michael Yardney Podcast. Watch out for our next show, which comes to you twice a week, and you'll learn some new ideas about property investment, success and money in around 30 minutes. To get more of Michael's thoughts, go across to www.propertyupdate.com.au and sign up for his daily morning briefing, and you'll hear from not only Michael but a group of leading property success and money experts. And just a reminder that the information you heard in this show today is general educational advice and not specific investment advice, as we don't know your personal circumstances. If you're looking for specific advice, why not ask the team at Metropole to help you?